Welcome on in, football fans. It's your boy Gsluke here with our Thursday night football preview for the matchup between the Commanders and the Eagles. Gonna make sure you're ready for all of your DFS and prop exposure. But first off, a look at the Showdown slate and how I'm handling the single game exposure there. And then afterwards, a look at some of my Underdog and Prize Picks props and a few pieces of exposure that I've already gone to myself. So a lot to go through here. Not gonna waste any time at all. It's first off, started off with the DFS side and what I'm doing for the Showdown slate. A good place to start is usually with an injury report where there are definitely a few moving pieces that we can have for Thursday. So first off, we got Devonta Smith down here as questionable. He's got sportsbook lines out there on the book, so I would expect him to be out there playing on Thursday, but is still technically questionable, so perhaps somebody that we're going to have to monitor before lock. Brian Robinson Jr. maybe a little bit more questionable out there for Thursday, as he doesn't have those same lines out there on sportsbook. So he's still technically questionable, could end up getting rolled in out there before lock, but as of right now is actually projected out in my projections. So that will have a trickle down effect on guys like an Austin Eckler, backups like a Gonzalez or a McNichols out there for the Commanders. But again, just another moving piece that we're going to want to monitor. I also got Dallas Goedert. He's questionable out there for Thursday. He's been playing recently, so maybe him and Smith, that's more of a precautionary thing than an actionable questionable tag. And then with the kicking situation over there with the Commanders, we've also got Austin Seibert down as questionable. So just like you have with Brian Robinson, I currently have him projected out, but that could change over there before Thursday. So in terms of value opening up, if you have Brian Robinson rolled out, that's going to make guys like Eckler, some of those other second string running backs out there for the Commanders a little bit more viable than they would be before. But because Goddard, Devonta Smith are almost for sure going to be playing on Thursday, I'm not expecting there to be a whole ton of value. If for some reason you had Goddard out, it's going to make Grant Calcaterra a much better play for Philly, and maybe some of those mid to lower tier wide receivers for Philly if Devonta Smith is out. That would be like a Jahan Dotson, maybe even a Johnny Wilson towards the bottom end of pricing, but we're not expecting that to be the case out there. So the main thing probably being Brian Robinson Jr. If he plays, it's a pretty soft price tag there at $8,200. If he's out, we're going to have to look to guys like an Austin Eckler for some value. But let's start at the top end of the board and mention the ownership heading out here into lock, where I think you're going to see a slight bias towards the Philly side of things. They are in fact 3.5 point favorites to the home team, so they're usually going to get a little bit more love out there from the masses, but I don't think it's going to be a massive change. Like, it's not going to be like everyone's playing 4-2 or 5-1 Philly lineups, because it's a divisional matchup, relatively high scoring affair, close to a 50 point total, and it is only a 3.5 point favorite out there towards Philly. I think you're going to see a lot of people playing 3-3 lineups. So if you're playing a 3-3 with both quarterbacks, some wide receivers from both teams, maybe going for that shootout sort of game script, in the large field GPP, you're going to have a really hard time getting different. Probably a lot of duplicates when you're going with a 3-3 build, and I think especially a lot of duplicates if you're using a 3-3 build with both quarterbacks. Even if you went with like a 4-2 Philly build, maybe slightly favored the team that is a 3.5 point favorite, that is also going to be extremely chalky out there for Thursday. So if you want to enter that kind of game script, just do it in the right sort of contest. If you want to enter something that's going to be a little bit more popular, usually the name of the game is to try and find a smaller field GPP, something like a single entry, maybe a 2-3 max contest to go out there and enter instead, as you're not playing against as many entries in those sort of contests on DraftKings. It's going to be a lot easier to move yourself up those leaderboards. So I would say if you're playing in the large field contests and you like yourself a 3-3 or a 4-2 Philly build, then you might want to scale back your exposure out there for Thursday. So I tend to agree with that. Last few slates have been a little bit chalky with my exposure, which is okay if you're entering the right sort of DFS contest. So for me, I tend to agree with that 3-3 script. This seems like a shootout written all over it. I thought the same thing about the Rams Dolphins. Obviously didn't end up getting that one right, but this game seems even more so into that kind of script. I mean, you got two offenses that are perfectly capable on either side. I think the Rams Dolphins all had their struggles out there on offense, whereas these two teams, I don't think we have those same kind of concerns. The Commanders, Jane Daniels has looked like an absolute baller this year, and with the Eagles side, though they maybe started a little bit slower than they've liked, the last month or so, they've looked like the old Eagles team. They've been extremely productive on the ground with Saquon Barkley. They've got A.J. Brown, Devonta Smith through the air. I don't have as many concerns in this kind of matchup. So unfortunately, a lot of the ownership is where I'm going to have a lot of my chips as well. So that's personally how I'm going to handle the slate from the ownership angle. But now going player by player, let's start towards the top here with Jalen Hurts, who is $11,000 on the slate. That's probably the only negative that you can find for Jalen Hurts. His projections through the roof is in fact over a 2.1x points per dollar value. When you get over a 1.8x is where you start to find some of the better plays on any given slate, and over a 2x is usually some of the better plays that we have, period, especially when it's a spend up. Now, you'll find guys that are over 2 points per dollar routinely down there in the value range, but you normally don't find a ton of them towards the top end of the pricing. The reason why we have so many in this matchup is because the projections through the roof, right? You've got nearly a 50-point total, you've got a close game script, and those are of course accounted for in my projection. So it's not just the Jalen Hurts that is projecting through the roof, but pretty much everyone from AJ Brown up is right near that 2x points per dollar, if not slightly just above it. So a Saquon, 2x right there, Jane Daniels, 2.1x as well. So both quarterbacks going to be a priority out there in lineups, but you also see that reflected with the ownership too. So your most expensive captains are also the four most popular captains that we have on the entire slate. You've got Jalen Hurts at nearly 75% total ownership, which makes getting different, makes finding leverage out there in contest really tough to do if you're just trying to do it with ownership itself. So if you're looking to generate leverage in those large field GPTs, I don't love these kind of lineups just because I think it is such an outside outcome, but it would be to go out there and fully stack one team or the other, right? Why you can't get different by taking ownership and, or at least towards the top end of the board, right? There's not going to be much leverage to be had. You can do it with your lineup construction because though you might be taking guys that are 30% plus at 4, maybe even 5 of your slots in that kind of lineup, if you're using a 5-1, especially if you're going like a 5-1 commander stack, but if you go with a 5-1 Philly stack, it's going to be a lot of the same. You're going to be getting different based on your lineup construction, not so much the actual ownership in your lineup. So large field GPPs, I think there are a few ways that you could get sneakily different to the field, but you're not going to do it with the actual game theory towards the top end of the board. Few other things to note here. Saquon, if you're going with a Philly heavy lineup, wouldn't be a bad idea to go ahead and throw him at captain, as if they're playing from ahead, he's going to get extra usage as they try and run out the clock. Jane Daniels at $10,400. He's the best play on the slate when it comes to comparing his projection to salary. 2.1x points per dollar and a little bit easier to fit into lineups than Jalen Hurts. What I'll also say about Jane Daniels is that if he happens to be playing from behind, like the game script would indicate, with them being 3.5 point underdogs, then he's going to have to throw even more as well. So the script could actually be favorable out there for Jane Daniels, whereas the Jalen Hurts, it could work against him a little bit if they're playing from ahead. AJ Brown, $10,000, more than fair enough price tag for the kind of upside that he brings. He has been an absolute monster on a yards per game basis. It hasn't necessarily been healthy for all of this year. That's why he's not towards the top of the list when it comes to like wide receiver 1 out there in fantasy. But if you look at him on a per game basis, he's up there with guys like a Jamar Chase when it comes to their efficiency. So $10,000, he for all accounts seems to be healthy out here for Thursday, which I think makes him extremely dangerous, not just at the flex position, but perhaps one of my favorite captains on the slate as well. He's going to be very popular there. You can see I've got him at just under 15% at the captain spot, but with his upside, his wide range of outcomes, I mean, if he gets you 100 yards, 2 touchdowns, you're going to have that at the captain spot. Terry McLaurin's down here at $9,000. He's the first player where you really start to see that points per dollar value start to tick down a little bit, partially because he's a little bit more expensive than he should be. Still projects as a solid play. If you can afford to mix him into lineups, you probably want to, especially because he's the number 1 target out there for Jane Daniels. You've got Devonta Smith here at $8,600. I'm not that worried about the Q tag, but as a reminder, going to want to make sure that he's actually playing there for Thursday, but the ownership also a little bit lower than some of those other top tier players. So if you're going down here to a McLaurin, a Devonta Smith, you're not really saving salary by getting to either option, but you are saving a little bit of that ownership. So again, not a pivot at 36% ownership with either player, but definitely a little bit lower than the 50% plus what you have with those top tier players. Brian Robinson Jr., if he plays, I'm definitely going to be using him out there in lineups. In fact, if he plays, I think in large field GBPs, he's going to be maybe the best option to try and get different to the field. It'd be safe to say that he's going to be a little little bit limited if he goes out there and plays, but at $8,200, that is baked into the price tag. So in my opinion, and if he plays, he's probably the best piece of leverage that you can get to, because not only is he going to be lower owned than he should be, in my opinion. Again, hard to say that before we really know if he's going to be playing and what the ownership looks like, but if you're giving me a sub 30% owned Brian Robinson Jr. and you're playing in a large field GPP, you're trying to get different, try and find a way to not duplicate yourself with 50 to 100 lineups when you go out there and win, a Brian Robinson Jr. captain lineup might be the way to do that out there on Thursday. Obviously, you're going to need Washington to probably win that game to be playing from ahead to get the usage that you're hoping for, but that is within his range of outcomes. He's already done that a few times a year with really big games, and I know Philly defense is a tough one. It's going to be tough to go out there and just run it down their throat, but the Commanders have 7 wins on the year, so we can't completely sleep on them either. Down in this mid-tier, Austin Eckler is currently projecting as the best piece of value in this range. A lot of because Brian Robinson Jr. is currently projected out, so a lot of that depending on the injury news, so a little bit up in flux on whether he'll be a play I'm getting to. Dallas Goedert here at $6,600. I really like the price tag out here on Goedert. Same thing with Noah Brown. Neither one is projecting for nearly a 2x points per dollar, but they are saving you some salary that you need to spend up top. So you're not going to be able to play 4 or 5 of these top end guys in every single lineup. You'd have to take like a $200 player to go out there and pull that off. You're going to need some of these mid-tier guys, and I think Goddard, if you're playing some Jalen Hurts, not a bad idea to correlate that out there with your quarterback, and vice versa out there with Noah Brown. A little bit of a revenge game going for Zach Ertz. Zach Ertz has also been quietly productive here in 2024. He's gotten over 4 receptions in most of his games this year, which, hint, hint, will be a little bit valuable when we get to the prop section later on, but also about 25% owned. So revenge narrative or not, I think that he's a solid play out there for Thursday. These kickers, always a decent option, but never my favorite. The more important aspect is making sure that you're playing the kicker that is actually active for Commanders. So make sure that you're keeping an eye on that injury news. These defenses, never my favorite plays, but you've seen the last few showdown slates that the defenses can in fact get there. Whether it's sloppy play like we saw on Monday, whether it's 4 or 5 interceptions for Jared Goff on Sunday Night Football, wacky stuff happens, particularly in these primetime games. Now, I'm not going to be chasing those performances just because it's hit the last few slates does not necessarily mean that it's going to hit going forward. And even in a few of those circumstances, you didn't have to have the defenses as the optimal play on that slate. So I think that's a perfect example, right? You can have all those different turnovers, all those things happen out there for a defense and them still not get there in some cases. Towards the very bottom end of the board, there's not a ton of obvious value at this point, but if there's any injury news that comes in last second, that could change the bottom end of the pricing. As of right now, they've got backup Kenneth Gainwell. If you expect the Eagles to go out there and roll, maybe he gets some extra usage towards the end of the game. Olamide Zaccheaus, he is a big play threat out there for the Commanders, but has a relatively low snap share percentage and is highly dependent on those downfield targets. Jeremy McNichols could be in play for some extra snaps if Brian Robinson Jr. sits. Same thing with Chris Rodriguez Jr. So a lot of their usage, a lot of their viability comes down to that injury news. Johnny Wilson, not really in play unless we have Devonta Smith out. So not really expecting him to be an option. Diami Brown, Luke McCaffrey, a few other players out there for Washington that you could use as a pure flyer play. Zaccheaus, Brown, McCaffrey are all going to see the field. We know this out there for Washington. It's just that none of them have a very sustainable workload. It's usually about like 30, maybe 40% of the snaps at the very most that those kind of players are going to be using. And they take a big play to get there in all cases. Like, they're not going to get you those 5-6 catches for 60 yards and get there in that kind of fashion. It's going to likely require a touchdown for one of these players to get there. So if you're playing in a single entry, a smaller field GPP, they're likely a little bit too risky to go out there and use in those kind of formats. But if you're playing in the large field GPP, you've got to find a way to get different and save that salary for a few other spend up options. That's the format where you play a Brown, a McCaffrey, or a Zaccheaus. Grant Calcaterra, he's been playing a lot of snaps for the Eagles, even with Dallas Goedert back. So at $1,000, he's actually one of my favorite plays towards the bottom end of the board. John Bates, the same thing. He's been playing quite a few snaps out there for the Redskins. Isn't projecting as, a crazy play, right? 1.3 projected points right there, but at least he's seeing snaps. And now for the prop side of things, where I've got a few props you might want to consider adding to your exposure yourself. So first one's going to be this over on Jalen Hurts passing yards, who not only has a solid game script going for him, high total game, closely contested script out there with just a 3.5 point spread, but also a matchup that makes sense as well. The Commanders have been bottom 10 against opposing quarterbacks this year, and with you've got Devonta Smith likely active, you've got Goddard back, AJ Brown in the mix, they have all their targets over there on Philly. So you've got two offenses that are perfectly capable. I think it's going to be a relatively high scoring affair, which likely all means that Hurts is going to have to pass more. And if for some reason the Commanders make this a little bit more competitive than it should be, then they could really have to pass over there for Philly. So 221 is a lot lower than where other books have him. He's at 226.5 on a lot of books, 227 over here on Underdog. So that's why personally I would recommend entering it over here on Prize Picks, as you have that 5-6 yard line value compared to other books out there. But that compared to with the traditional analysis of him just having a solid matchup this week is why I wanted to take that over. So I paired it up with this over on Zach Ertz, who does have that revenge game going this weekend. He's at 3.5 receptions. Not really any juice yet for the over. I believe on FanDuel he was like -120, Pinnacle in that same range out there for the over. So maybe a little bit of a sprinkle towards the over here, but this comes down to traditional analysis. He's covered this in 6 of his games this year, well over a 60% hit rate out there towards the over. And in a few of his games for the under, he got to 3. I believe it was 2 out of the 4 he didn't get there. He ended up getting to 3 receptions. And a few of them also came down to injuries where he left the game early. So in games where he's started, he's been there the entire game. He's hitting this at closer to like a 70-75% clip this year. So you add that with the revenge narrative, also the fact that the Commanders are actually underdogs for once. They've been the favorites for their last 4 or 5 games, including against the Steelers there last week. And at 3.5 receptions, if they're going to have to pass more, potentially playing from behind, he's healthy. You've got a matchup against Philly too, which is also favorable out there towards tight ends. It's why I like this over. And unfortunately, Prize Picks is starting to get a little bit more strict when it comes to their correlation rules. This does only pay 2.75x. Over on Underdog, that would be a 3x payout, but they do have the passing yard prop 6 yards higher. So that I chose to take it on Prize Picks with the slightly lower payout. If you want the 3x payout, you could go over there to Underdog and enter it yourself, but just know that you're not going to get the same line over there on Jalen Hurts. So maybe they end up bumping this to 226 over here on Prize Picks. That might make the better site to play it after bumps over here on the Underdog side. So just wanted to point that out for people that are playing on one site versus the other. But of course, for all the different pieces of exposure that I'm getting to, make sure to check out my Patreon page for all of that. I'm posting all the slips I'm getting to, the reasoning behind it, trying to make you guys better NFL bettors yourselves, to go out there and improve your process. So not only if you join the Patreon page are you going to get access to all the slips that I enter, but you're also going to get the educational aspect as well, where not only am I trying to give you guys profit, right, give you guys props that should be out there and value bump in our favor, but I'm also trying to teach you guys how to find that value, right? What I'm looking for in plays, how I know that props are going to bump in our direction before that ends up happening. So if you want all of that, if you want all the reasoning behind my props as well, go out there, check out the Patreon page. But it's all I've got out there for Thursday Night Football. Alrighty guys, that is all I've got for the preview this evening. Best of luck out there with all of your exposure tomorrow. Before you hop on out of here, one thing I ask is to go out there and smash that like button, and also subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of the content when it drops. That'll of course include our main slate preview this week, Monday Night Football preview out there for the Showdown slate Monday, as well as all the content throughout the rest of the season. And also for a chance to earn a free month on my Patreon page, go ahead and comment down below who you've got as your top scorer out there for Thursday night slate in terms of DraftKings fantasy points. So it's not going to be captain points, it'll just be over there at the flex position. Whoever the top scorer is on the slate, go ahead, give me your best guess down below and their projection within 2 points. If you end up getting that, you will win a free month on my Patreon page just for doing so. So best of luck out there with the giveaway, any of your exposure out there for Thursday. Let's take down a GPP or two. Let's go out there and cash out on our prop slips and make it a fun one out there for this divisional matchup.